spatula, dildo, gynecologist, taxidermy are the four that come up the most. And every single time that person thinks they're the first person to ever think of them.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Story Building, where stories are always on the brain. Today's guest is theatre writer, improviser, and someone with a deceptively easy to pronounce surname. It is Shane Adamczak. Welcome to One Story Building.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be on somebody else's podcast for a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Your podcast, what's going on with that one? Plug immediately. Go.
It's called Good Morning, Mrs. Strawberry. It's on a bit of a break right now. It's basically me and a guest, 25 minutes, just talking about whatever they want to talk about based on one word that they choose at the start of the show. It's real silly.
What's an example of that one word?
We've had, oh my goodness, we've had lots. We've had dice, we've had play, we've had imagination, lots and lots of different words.
Well, to start off with, you have been the artistic director for the Australian theatre company Weeping Spoon for, if my maths is correct, well over 17 years. And the first question has to be, of course, Weeping Spoon Productions. Where did that name originate?
Ooh, good question. Starting off with making me remember something from a long time ago. I think it came about when we first formed the company. We were throwing around a lot of names, and the first name we came up, we were going to call ourselves Hack, as in like hack the system kind of thing, which is a bit of a cheesy name, and it was also then taken by a show on Triple J. So while we were brainstorming, we were, as was our want at the time, mucking around a lot. And we drew a bunch of faces on a bunch of cutlery, and we were just mucking around when we really should have been having a serious team meeting. And we had two characters. We had the Weeping Spoon and Flamo Fork. And Flamo Fork, we filmed a short film of Flamo Fork killing the Weeping Spoon. And it was literally a crying piece of cutlery. And we went, oh, that'll be the name. And then it just was forever. So that's the story. It's because we drew a face on a spoon one time.
So many creative names for these theatre productions, and I was thinking just today, how much of an impact do you think that the names of not just theatre productions but just production companies in general, how much of an impact do you think they have on drawing audiences in with their kooky names?
I think it helps to have a memorable name. Is that you can go, oh, that was a such and such show, or this show was done by such and such. How important it is to drawing a crowd, I don't know the name itself. I think I've seen lots of really, really amazing shows from companies that I couldn't tell you any of the actors' names or the company name. So I think it helps to have something memorable, but the really important thing is making good content for people.
Well, of course, you've been making content for almost 2 decades now. And I have to ask, starting all the way back from 2005, how do you think theatre in general has changed over the last 17 years from your insider perspective?
That is a good question. In West Australia, I think it's changed quite a lot. I think there's been a focus away from sort of lower budget, indie, fun comedy stuff to focus a little bit on more serious work that maybe isn't as general public friendly. This is sort of just speaking quite generally. I think in terms of work as an independent artist, I think a lot of things have changed in the landscape of the world, not just in theatre, as in terms of looking at like gender identity and sexuality and gender politics, and all that, all the stuff that comes with that. So I think there's sort of been a changing landscape in that, in the ways that people are creating shows as well, and the people that want to be creating shows with certain demographics and certain types of people, which I think is great and really positive thing. But overall, I think the spirit of theatre is still there. There's still lots of great indie theatre happening everywhere. I spend a lot of time touring the Canadian Fringe circuit, which is sort of my bread and butter in the before times, as I like to call it. And I think there's just a little bit more focus on theatre in that Fringe circuit, whereas the Fringe circuit here in Australia looks a lot more at like burlesque and comedy and a bit more variety, cabaret stuff, as it were. Whereas the Canadian circuit focuses more on theatre, which is kind of more what I'm about.
Yeah. I tell you, every time I open up the brochure for the Australian Fringe Festivals, 80% it's like comedy and burlesque shows, and I'm like, where's the rich, deep theatre that I'm thirsting for? It's just it needs to be more diverse, which is what you do. You do theatre. You do what I'm after, what I really want to dig into as the artistic director of Weeping Spoon. Now, I've already asked this question to at least one other person before, but given the vague terms in the hierarchy of the arts, what does an artistic director actually do?
Ooh. Are you familiar with the band Panic at the Disco, Cody?
I know the name.
Yeah, so Panic at the Disco basically started as a group of 5 or 6 guys, and over time, people from that band sort of got whittled out, swapped around, and changed. And now, Panic at the Disco is essentially just one guy. So Weeping Spoon is essentially like the Panic at the Disco of the Perth theatre scene. We started as a company of 5. Some of us kind of branched off for other projects, joined other companies. So being the artistic director of Weeping Spoon basically means that I'm a little bit of a one-man band, in that I do most of everything at Weeping Spoon, and then I have sort of a collective of people that I collaborate with on a very often often on a very great sort of collaborative basis, if that makes sense. So it's basically Weeping Spoon is currently me and sort of like 4 or 5 other people that come in and out of the company, depending on the projects that we're working on. So my job is basically looking at the sorts of shows that we want to be making out, doing all the sort of producing, publicity, media behind all those shows, and just getting those shows out there, touring them around the world where possible. Doing a lot of different things online when we were in lockdown. That was sort of my main gig. We produced a whole series of like live concerts and did our show Captain Spaceship online for the first time, which was challenging but very fun. And so, yeah, being artistic director is a little bit of everything all the time, constantly juggling.
You mentioned doing a show online. Now, I haven't prepared this question, but I have to ask, given we are in a post-2020 world, theatre, online theatre, digitalness when it comes to physical performances, how important do you think physical theatre and audiences going out to see an actual live event, how important do you think that is nowadays, given the fact that we can just watch stuff online?
Oh, so important, so incredibly important to have lost that during the main part of the pandemic was heartbreaking for not only so many artists but for the art scene. There's something about being in a room with people and being on stage and performing to an audience and having that immediacy of feedback and reaction that you can't replicate with an online streaming thing. I think online streaming was an amazing tool when there was no other options, but there really is nothing better than being able to be in the room with the artists, with the performers, and feeling the atmosphere in the room, feeling the vibe, hearing the laughs, hearing the tears, and just having that actual atmosphere of being together in the space and creating something.
Absolutely. I say many times that there is nothing better than a live performance. It beats any recording of anything ever, because like you said, you're there and you can feel the aura of the room. So with your own specific shows as possible examples, one thing that I have come across when I write shows, review shows, talk about shows, watch shows, is that some people, especially when they're starting out, is that the first couple of shows that they don't do that well because they write shows that they specifically think are cool and that they would enjoy. So what they do is that they create this gigantic bulbous darling that they should have killed before they even really started. So as someone who devises your own material for commercial use, how do you write shows that would be enjoyed by people that don't just share your own idiosyncratic sensibilities?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one because you want to have yourself in your work, but you also want to have a piece that people are going to see. And one thing I've always tried to do is when I'm creating work is not only, draw from my own experience and create things that I would want to see, but shows that are accessible to not only audiences that go to see theatre audiences that, just go see like a Shakespeare play once a year at the main theatre or go see like a big mainstream musical. I want to create a show that's accessible, alternative, fringy, a little bit punk, but average Joe public can bring his mum and dad, and they're going to be a little bit taken back, a little bit confused, a little bit turned on, and then walk out of that experience going, man, theatre is great, theatre is cool, theatre is funny, theatre is accessible, and I want to see more of it. So yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because especially when you're young, you want to put a lot of yourself out there into the world and be like, hey, this is who I am as an artist. And it's about kind of finding that balance between this is what's in my brain and this is what's going to work on stage and this is what people are going to like. And I think after a couple of years, you kind of manage to find that balance. And for some people, that's not what they want. Some people just want to say, this is me, this is my art, this is what I'm putting out there, take it or leave it kind of thing. As well as other people who are just going to be like, I just want to make something that's going to make a lot of money and people are going to like, here's another jukebox musical, you know?
Aside from jukebox musicals, do you have any examples of shows that would make a lot of money, that might be kind of shallow and general audience-y, but what would sell well nowadays for theatre?
Look, if I knew that, I'd be a millionaire, quite frankly. I'd be at least a thousandaire.
No, yeah.
Look, yeah, I mean, like, it's a tricky thing because the Perth Fringe Festival has gone in a direction where it's become so big now and so oversaturated with like variety and cabaret and burlesque and comedy. And obviously there's like an audience for that. There's a space for that. But the balance for a fringe that's so big and that it's been sold to people for so many years is like, look at all these crazy burlesque characters and all these crazy comedians, that a fringe that really should be focused, I think, on the theatre scene, which is incredibly strong in Western Australia, has kind of like slipped away from what I would really like it to be. Again, going back to that, you know, that focus on theatre. So I don't know, I guess like there's a show like, I mean, I don't want to like point out any specific shows, but just like burlesque shows that are themed over like mainstream movies that are just going to pull in a bunch of people who are going, ooh, I like that thing and I like boobs. Let's check it out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this is all just because Perth is so small compared to the rest of the planet. I mean, when you go to larger countries, their fringe festivals are actually fringe festivals because they're under the umbrella of so many larger productions. But because Perth is so small, the Fringe Festival is just an arts festival. It's not really competing with anything that large.
Yeah, and there's so much stuff in the Perth Fringe that I would consider to be relatively mainstream and not particularly fringy at all. Especially when there's like this balance or lack of balance, rather, of these like really big acts that are in these really big tents that are doing shows every night at the Fringe, and then little, you know, independent acts that get, you know, 5 nights in a little back of a pub somewhere. Which, you know, and the audiences of Perth as well, because we've had this Fringe for just going on a decade now, have been trained that Fringe is like in this park in Northbridge where you can get beer and food, and also there's shows there as well, but mainly there's beer and food, and it's really sold on that. And yeah, I really struggle with that a little bit, where it's very much become like this weird sort of like beer and food and burlesque festival where it should be a little bit of everything for everyone, and getting Perth really into what Fringe is, which is outside of the mainstream stuff that's going to push and challenge you, and, you know, is a little bit punk and a little bit rock and roll, you know?
I tell you, a few years ago, I finally completed a 1-hour theatre piece that took me on and off about a year's worth of writing to complete. And I did it in a venue where before or after my show, there was a comedian who had her hour before or after mine. She came out, did about 5 minutes of fairly standard stand-up, and then brought out a projector, and then for 55 fucking minutes just Ray William Johnsoned her way through a bunch of like weird Google images, and was like, hey, look at this, hey, look at this. Her opening night audience was larger than my entire run's audience. Bear in mind, mine was a theatre show that cost me hundreds, if not thousands of dollars with makeup and costumes and everything. She was just there, said crap, and then got more attention. And I realized this is so unfair. It's just like a popularity contest, especially when you're starting out. Just have more friends in the arts and you're going to have more people come to you. Have you found that, especially when starting out in theatre?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely lots of factors to it where you see, I mean, I've had many friends, again, from like the Canadian circuit that have come over to Perth Fringe with like really amazing, big award-winning shows from North America, who were, you know, just basically put shaft aside into like crappy little venues, terrible time slots, and just completely ignored by the festival. That really just are just trying to sell, tickets to the big shows, which it's very frustrating because, to me, that's never been what Fringe is. It's about being on the outskirts and all those little shows. And Perth, when there's a show that's, $80, like there should be no Fringe shows that cost more than $30, in my opinion, max. If there's a show that's $60 and people will go out and see that one big circus show, whatever it is, for $60, $70, $80, and they leave and they go, right, that's it. I'm done. I've done Fringe. I've seen a Fringe show. You saw one Fringe show, whereas you took that money, you could have seen 4 tiny little independent shows, people you've never heard of. It's about like taking a chance on the little guy and not just seeing like some guy that you've seen, on the project or whatever. There's space for all of these performers, and I think everyone should be allowed to be part of Fringe, but there's a real imbalance with the stuff that I think gets pushed. And yeah, it can be very, very, very frustrating.
Don't I know it? But your shows, your fantastic, famous shows, we have a man living in another man's beard, a man losing his family and then going into space, and an improv science fiction show. Okay, intentionally generic question, incoming 3, 2, 1. Where do you come up with your ideas?
Sometimes they come to me in dreams, Cody. Sometimes I find them in the back of a newspaper. No, they come from different places. A lot of them come from life experience and whatever I'm going through as a person or an artist. So, for example, the Ballad of Frank Allen, which is the show about a tiny man that lives inside another man's beard, came about from a very short song that I wrote for my friend Al, who's a very big, beardy Canadian man who I love. We used to be on this podcast in Montreal, and it was his final show. And so for his final show, I wrote this song called The Ballad of Frank Allen, a story about a tiny man that lived in his beard, that basically everything that Al had ever done that was successful was because of something that the tiny man in his beard had done for him. And it was just a sort of a throwaway song, a funny kind of thing, but we really liked the concept. So I started writing a short story series once a week on this blog that we wrote for the ongoing adventures of Frank Allen. And then eventually, I got so much of this story, I was like, this is great, and I love this. And I love the fact that it's actually about a man that lives in a real person that I know's beard. And so I was like, this would make a great show. So I wrote a 2-hander about myself, Frank Allen, and Al, played by various performers over the years, as the man with the beard. And that was just an example of a show that... So Kevin Smith, the director, when he was creating this movie Tusk, I don't know if you're familiar with Tusk.
I've seen Tusk, and I like it more than it deserves.
Yeah, it's a very bizarre movie about a man that essentially gets kidnapped and turned into a walrus. It's bizarre. Yeah. And when he was talking about the creation of that movie, he was like, I came up with this concept about a guy that gets kidnapped and turned into a walrus, and I realized I have to make this movie because if I want to see this movie, no one else is ever going to make this movie. And that was kind of how I went into The Ballad of Frank Allen. I want to do a comedy about a man who lives inside another man's beard. That's something I've never seen. I can't imagine anybody else is going to make that show. So if I want it to exist, I have to make it. And so I think it's about having an original idea, putting something into the world that hasn't existed yet, show something that no one's ever seen before.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about quite recently when I look back on the things that I've done, what I've created. I'm not the most famous person in the world, but I got to create.
Yet, Cody.
Well, it depends who I'm interviewing next. My shows aren't the most famous thing in the world, but I still got to make a thing that I would have liked to see public. And the fact that I made it, that just makes me feel so good that I was able to give the world something that I myself would have liked to have seen. But now we're sort of going back to how do you get an audience to like things that you like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just about just finding your audience, putting it out there and hoping that you reach the right people. We did a show called Vicious Circles, which was all about the Sex Pistols and punk and the, beginning and end of punk scene. And that was a really weird show because trying to promote that to like a theater audience was a tricky one because it was a pretty gnarly show. But once we started pitching that show to people that were into punk music and reaching all these punk groups and all these people on, different punk-based Facebook groups, and we started getting all these like punk musos and stuff along to the show, that's when we really started to build our audience because it was filled with music and it was pretty full on and violent and gritty and lots of cussing and very, very dirty and sweaty and punk. And it's just about trying to find new people. So when we do Captain Spaceship, which is like our improvised Star Trek kind of show, we reach out to the local like Perth Nerd Herd and like different sci-fi groups, and just finding those people that are going to dig it and hopefully spread the word. You just got to get that first little audience in there, and then hope over the years that audience is loyal and will come back.
Very clever. Something that I've noticed when I've been watching theatre for the years that I've been watching theatre is that community theatre, and especially community theatre versions of larger productions, are, like 9 times out of 10, good enough compared to the larger, more expensive productions. So with fringe festivals still going strong and the barrier for becoming an artist just getting lower and lower, what do you think this means for the future of theatre and the arts in general when so many people can just start doing it?
Oh, I think it's great. I mean, I've seen hundreds of, super expensive big Broadway musicals that have been amazing and I love them. But the best shows that I've ever seen always will be the tiny little 1-2-hander shows that I saw in the back pub of a fringe show, because those of a fringe venue, because those shows that have no budget, have no lighting, have no projection, have, minimal tech, have to rely on the content of the show, of the heart, of the story, of the performances. And those will always be the shows that stick with my brain. And that's why I just really, really love encouraging people when it comes fringe time to just go take a chance on a random show at a random time, at a random venue, because that performer will not only appreciate you being there, but it's going to give you an experience that you've never had before. And one thing I really believe is that whenever you see a really good fringe show, you'll talk about that fringe show, for a week or two, right? And you'll spread the word, which is great. If you see a really terrible fringe show that was just the worst thing you've ever seen, you will remember and talk about that show forever. So it's win-win as far as I'm concerned when it comes to fringe.
Yeah, absolutely. I go to shows that I think would be interesting to watch, not things that I think would be good, but just if they have an interesting premise, I like to see if they pull it off. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes when I write a show, sometimes it gets pulled off, sometimes it doesn't. And it's just interesting to see how everyday people, for lack of a better word, are able to be creative in their spare time.
Absolutely. And I love people giving a fringe show a go for the first time. I had a friend in Adelaide who was just absolutely terrified of being on stage, but has seen, every fringe show I've ever done and everyone else's fringe show they've ever done. And one year gave the challenge to herself saying, this year I'm going to do a fringe show just about being terrified of being on stage. And it was absolutely glorious. And like the support she had from everyone going like, you've been there for us over so many years to see our shows, to go see her perform on stage, absolutely crapping her pants, but performing a delightful show. And then at the end of that season going, that was terrifying for me. I'm never doing that again, but I'm so glad that I've done it. And that's an experience that I hope a lot of people have. Not so much the terror, but just giving it a go for the first time.
So what would you recommend someone giving it a go for the first time? What should they be preparing for and prepping? And what should they be if they're thinking about stepping into doing theatre?
Be prepared not to make a lot of money is my biggest piece of advice. Make sure that if you are going into theatre, especially independent theatre, make sure you're doing it because you love it, because you're sure that it's what you do and it's what gets you up in the morning, is what gets you excited. And because if you don't do it, your head will explode. It was beautiful to see all these artists during the very start of the pandemic trapped inside and having to find all these amazing sort of creative pivots, whether that be cooking or doing a podcast or doing an online streaming thing, to fill that void of being, needing to create, needing to put stuff out there. And yeah, if that's how you feel, just jump in head first and latch on to artists that have been doing it for a while, because there's so many artists that were around when I first started out that, were much bigger than I am and still much bigger than I am. But I just sort of reached out and said, hey, I'm doing a show. Do you want to come check it out? Can I come see your show? Can you give me some advice? And in my early years, I was so incredibly grateful for some of the advice and support that I was given by other artists, because at the end of the day, I think really artists need to have each other's backs. It needs to not be a competition of my show's better than yours, I'm selling better than you. Like it's not a race. It's a marathon that we're all part of this big hideous beast together of limbs and comedy and feathers and what have you. And it's about us, working together as a community to create something amazing for our audiences and helping each other out and not trying to knock each other down. So yeah, go in with a good, positive mindset, look for advice, don't expect a lot of money. Make something good, make something new.
Speaking of artists having each other's backs and helping each other out, improvisational comedy. You have been a member of the Big HOO-HAA, the Australian improv group, for many a year, and your recent show, Captain Spaceship, has improv elements sewn right into that. Improv comedy in fringe shows has just exploded over the last couple of years, especially among millennials like us. What do you think draws so many people to improv comedy recently?
I think improv, when it's done well, is very exciting, and improv, when it's done badly, is still in its own way very watchable and exciting. There's an element of danger in improv. Obviously, as a performer, you go out there with nothing, and you've got to rely on your own brain and the other performances to make something good, and you have to rely on the audience to be there on that journey with you. And one of the glorious things about improv is that the audience will have your back and they want to see you succeed, but they're also aware that if you fail, like, it's not the end of the world. Like, I've done so many things in improv shows that have throwaway gags that, just died on their ass, and you need to be able to just go, nah, it really doesn't matter, because at the end of this night, I'm never going to remember anything I said in this show, probably ever again. All I want to do is go on stage, do the best I can, support my other performers and the other players, hope they've got my back as well, and let's give the audience a hell of a show, because that's the goal. It's not to be like, I'm the star of this show, I'm the big cheese, I'm the best improviser. It's like, as a collective, let's give this audience the best piece of art we can in this 50-minute slot. And there's something really magical about that, and something very watchable as an audience. And of course, going out there, watching a show, knowing the audience, knowing that the performers have no idea what's going to happen, and often having a lot of influence on the show, is a very exciting thing for audiences as well.
And it's handy because it's quite cheap, because you don't have to have the responsibility of having props and costumes, because you just have to rely on the audience's free imagination.
Yeah, it also pays to have a good tech person that's ready to go on the fly. We've done lots of seasons of Captain Spaceship where we've just had like such amazing lighting and sound techs, where we're like, okay, here's a bunch of sound effects we have. These are some lighting states. Here's a smoke machine. Just, you got to roll with the punches. And we've had some really, really amazing techs that have just thrown great stuff into the shows, offered us awesome lighting effects. So they're like, now it's blue and it's smoky, so it's cold. And we're like, okay, that's what we're doing. Great. And we've just given them free reign, and it's so fun to have that extra player as well, as part of the ensemble.
So how exactly do you rehearse and practice improv?
Well, it's different. For something like Captain Spaceship, we have sort of a very loose format for the show. We know there's going to be like this kind of beginning, this kind of middle, this kind of end. We'll have a guest in that plays a villain, and that's basically the only things that we know are definitely going to happen. Beginning, middle, end. This person's a villain at some point. Obviously there's going to be some kind of conflict and resolution. So we just come in, we have characters that we play constantly. For Captain Spaceship, we have ongoing characters, so we just have just rehearsal shows where we just do like mini half-hour episodes where we just try stuff out, work with different guests, and just have people come in and just throw stuff at us and see what works. And but you can't really, it doesn't matter how much you rehearse. At the end of the day, it's about just building the strength of the ensemble. I think it's about building that team hive mind where you know each other's strengths and weaknesses, things that are going to delight each other on stage, things that are going to challenge each other on stage. And it's about having that sort of that little wheelhouse in your head of, when I'm in this show, this is what I can throw to these people, and we're all going to have a really good time. Whereas a show like the Big HOO-HAA, where we do lots of short form games, we just rehearse the games. We rehearse, usually weekly or monthly, and just rehearse a bunch of games. People bring in brand new games that we try, and we just practice in different combos and just get to know each other and throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks.
Are there any jokes that you come up with at rehearsal, and then when it's time to actually do it in front of an audience, you sneakily bring it back on stage?
In an improv show?
Sure, unbeknownst to the audience.
Probably not. Nothing springs to mind. I'm sure there's gags that we've done in the Big HOO-HAA 1,000 times when we play our one-liner games, and we get the same suggestions over and over again. So I'm sure there's jokes that have come up. But with something like Captain Spaceship, where it's long form and it's very, very different every episode, it's pretty rare that we'll bring something back that was in a rehearsal. Often we'll do callbacks to previous episodes because they're It's like an ongoing story. So there's, that kind of stuff. There's callbacks to previous episodes, but there's nothing like a really good joke that happened in rehearsal. Let's put that in the show. That's pretty rare, unless it's very, 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 very good.
I remember I was talking with Perth giant Sam Longley and Big HOO-HAA member.
He's a giant man, and I love him.
How tall is he? Like 6'8" or something?
I think he's 6'10".
Oh, there you
go. Yeah, we're in a show together at the moment, and all the publicity photos were quite difficult, and it made me realize that I'm quite short when standing next to him.
I've seen him squeeze into black lycra, which was very, very fun and very interesting. But he was talking to me about improv the other years ago, and he said, rule number one when it comes to improv, try to have a joke or some kind of story based on the prompt spatula, because so many audience members think that they're just so clever because they're like, oh, spatula, think of a thing, spatula. So apparently that's some sort of like common suggestion from the audience. Spatula.
Yeah, I would say spatula, dildo, gynecologist, taxidermy are the four that come up the most. And every single time that person thinks they're the first person to ever think of them.
I've seen a few improv shows, like maybe even just two ever, that are not comedic. It's like Improv Shakespeare, another one that escapes me at the time. But what do you think it is about improv that makes it so intrinsically comedic, apparently?
I think there's the immediacy of it, and there's like the fear behind it. And it's getting laughs in an improv show. It's like a reward for taking that risk, I think. I've done a few improv shows that weren't like inherently comedy, that may have had elements of comedy, but that were serious. And that's a whole like fun challenge as well, especially as someone that's, quite a comedic performer, to do a show and not have to rely on that crutch, of comedy, of just going, I'm just going to sit in this scene. I'm just going to play the truth of it. I'm just going to act how this character would act with these other characters. And there's something really exciting about that as well. Even for an audience, just to see the push and the pull of the tension rising in a scene of the drama, and then having little moments of sort of like comedic relief where it kind of just bursts that tension for a little while and allowing that kind of tension to build up again. So yeah, it's fun to do both.
Before I get onto the last, oh so important last question of One Story Building, I must say, plug away. Where can people go to find out all about your little things?
You can see all of my little things in lots of places on the web, but if you want a main hub, I would check out weepingspoon.com. That's the main theatre company website where you can check out links to all of our past shows and see what's coming up in the future.
Mm-hmm. Your show vehicle with Perth giant Sam Longley. What's that about, and why should I bother to go see it?
Well, because based on the rehearsals we have left, it's going to be manic. It's a really fun show. This is like my first big show back since COVID. So I'm very, very excited to not only be on stage again with a brand new sort of original Weeping Spoon show, but to be doing a show with Sam where we've done improv together for years and we've performed in shows together for years. But this is the first thing that just the two of us have done together that's scripted. I think it's a very, very funny show. It's basically Sam and myself playing versions of ourselves on a road trip across regional West Australia to go to perform at the Muckenbuden Comedy Showcase. And it's the two idiotic versions of us getting trapped in the Australian outback and having to survive. And it's a very silly show. It's got what we like to call hearts, farts, and smarts, where it's got lots of hearts, a bit of fart humor, and a little bit of brains to it as well. It's a really fun show, and to perform with Sam as well is just like, it's a real kick because he's real fun. We've got really similar senses of humor as well. So we've made something very silly, and I think people are going to really, really dig it.
All right, well, here comes the last question that I always ask at the last moment of this thing that I do. And that is, of course, why are stories important?
Wow, that's a big question. Stories are important because that's how we hold on to our history, for one thing. It's like, stories getting passed down from generation to generation through stories, but also creating new stories and new pieces of art and using theatre and drama and comedy and what have you and performance to reach people and to tell your story, to tell other people's stories. and spread the word and express things and challenge people and make people laugh. Most importantly, make people happy and make people laugh through the stories that we tell. And I think that's super important, especially in a time where, the last couple of years we've been a little bit isolated. The world's been a little bit dark, and hopefully we're starting to get a little bit more towards the light. And there's got to be people out there that are willing to tell the stories of darkness, but also shed light onto like a world and take people out of the darkness now and then, because there's a lot of theatre out there that's really intense, really full on, and really confrontational. And there's a place for that, but I think equally as important is shows that lighten the mood, make people feel good, make people feel encouraged to be alive again. And I think that's just so important to laugh through the stories that we tell.
Mr. Shane Adamczak, thank you so much for coming on to One Story Building.
It's been great. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for having a chat.